Hey everybody, this is a section from Baruch Knei-Paz's The Social and Political Thought of Leon Trotsky. Um, the section is titled The Impact of Industrialization, and this is on the sociology of backwardness in pre-Soviet Russia. So here we go. A. New section. A. Innovation and backwardness. In the last 2 decades or so of the 19th century, in a program of industrialization unprecedented for its speed and scope, Russia may be said to have entered, however incompletely and however guardedly, the modern industrial age. By Western standards, of course, Russia's progress still did not amount to very much, even at the end of this period. All the determination, effort, and financial acumen of a Vita, or WIT, WITTE. He was like the economics minister or whatever. Notwithstanding, Russia was far from taking her place amongst the handful of European nations which could then be described as either industrial or advanced. The overall character of the country was not appreciably transformed, but the pace and extent of her industrial growth, in relation to her own immediate past, was truly astonishing. Footnote: Seton Watson, The Russian Empire, 1801 to 1917, Chapter 14, summarizes the most important facts and figures on Russia's industrialization during this period. On the motives and problems of industrialization, see T.H. von Laue, Sergei Vita, and the Industrialization of Russia. On Russia's economic development in general during the 19th century, see Alexander Gerschenkron, Economic Backwardness and Historical Perspective, published in 1966. I'm going to look some of these up. One moment. So, The Russian Empire, 1801 to 1917, by Hugh Seton Watson. The description says, from the reign of Alexander I to the abdication of Nicholas II, this wide-ranging survey of Russian history follows the development of institutions, classes, political movements, and individuals, and draws on a large body of documentary material and contemporary scholarship, making an important contribution to pre-revolutionary Russian studies. I'm not seeing anything for the Sergei White book. Economic Backwardness by Alexander Gerschenkron. The description says, these 14 essays covering a wide range of subjects of great current interest reflect the continuous evolution of the author's thought from 1951 to 1961. Range and flexibility characterize Alexander Gerschenkron's dynamic approach to Europe's industrial history, connecting evolution in industrial countries with their degree of economic backwardness. Gerschenkron presents the industrialization of the continent as a, quote, case of unity and diversity, end quote, thus offering a cogent alternative, supported by case studies, to the traditional view of industrialization as monotonous repetition of the same process from country to country. Brought together for the first time, these essays were originally published in specialized periodicals in the United States and abroad. Explaining and systematizing the elements of creative innovation in industrial history, Gerschenkron opens new paths of research and poses a number of pertinent questions for the problem of economic development in backward countries. Gerschenkron's versatile analysis not only includes construction of ingenious industrial output indices and fruitful historical hypotheses of the index number problem, but also original insights gleaned from his study of Soviet novels and a brilliant critique of Dr. Zhivago. End footnote. Back to the text, end footnote. Where am I? The Russian state did not embark on its policy of industrial expansion as a response to inner pressures and interests. As Trotsky had tried to show, and it was discussed in the previous section, these were prevented from emerging by the state's domination of the state's privileged classes and of economic development as a whole. The policy of industrialization was rather governed, as other economic innovations had been in the past, by external pressures and fears. By the fear, above all, as White had often expressed it, that otherwise Russia would become a virtual colony of European powers. Industrialization, therefore, was to be imposed from above by whatever means necessary, and upon a largely agricultural society presumably ill-prepared for it. However, the surprising thing, according to Trotsky, is how far this, quote, artificial approach, this, quote, grafting on of industry succeeded. Russia's, quote, industrial revolution, in fact revealed, in Trotsky's view, the great extent of the capacities of a backward society to absorb innovations, and thereby exposed, again, a seeming paradox. Backwardness was no barrier to the rapid assimilation of, and adaptation to, the most modern techniques of economic production. On the contrary, not only was a backward society capable of quickly adopting new economic forms, it also had the capacity for perfecting them, in a way which even advanced economies had not succeeded in doing. In the second of the essays comprising the book 1905, Trotsky presented figures which in Trotsky's view attested to this phenomenon. So long as the state's commitment to industrialization was either half-hearted or partial, the process was slow and almost insignificant. But once the commitment became final and determined, industry literally sprang up from the ground. Thus, for example, it was during the last decade of the 19th century that 40% of all enterprises first appeared. Similarly, with production, in 1767, Russia produced 10 million poods of pig iron. 100 years later, in 1866, Russia had reached only 19 million poods. Footnote, the Russian pood is equivalent to 16.3 kilograms. End footnote. But by 1896, Russia was producing 98 million poods, and in 1904, 180 million poods. Trotsky cited similar figures for petroleum production. But even more significant than the scope of growth was, in Trotsky's view, the manner in which industry had become organized and eventually structured. Since industrialization was to be rapid, industrialization could not grow out of already existing enterprises. There was, as a result, no gradual development, no normal extension of existing facilities, no organic growth. Instead, new industries were simply created. One consequence of this, which would later have an impact on Russia's class structure, was that the small manufacturer, the artisan, the middle producer, was either ignored or wiped out, since he was unable to keep pace with technical change and the financial exigencies of accelerated development. Thus, a disproportionate part of industrial production became concentrated in large industries, set up and financed by the state, unrelated organically to the rest of the Russian economy. It is these industries which gave Russia her industrial character. The small and middle-sized industries, so important in the development of the West, never played a central role in Russia. Trotsky provided the following figures to show how extensive this phenomenon was. At the turn of the century, nearly 43% of all industrial workers were employed in 453 enterprises of 1,000 workers or more each. The rest were dispersed amongst nearly 34,000 enterprises, employing less than 1,000 workers each. Similarly, nearly one-half of all enterprises realized profits amounting to less than 10% of total commercial and industrial profits, while less than 2% of the enterprises accounted for 45% of all profits. Comparing industrial concentration to that of Germany and Belgium, Trotsky tried to show again how seemingly paradoxical Russian development was. In Germany, in 1895, only 296 enterprises employed 1,000 or more workers each, accounting for 10% of all workers. According to the corresponding figures for Russia in 1902, there were 302 enterprises employing 1,000 or more workers each and accounting for nearly 40% of total workers. In the case of Belgium, also in 1895, 184 enterprises employed 500 or more workers each, amounting to 28% of all workers. In Russia, in 1902 again, enterprises employing 500 or more workers each numbered 726 and represented nearly 54% of all workers. Footnote. The table which Trotsky gave on page 33 includes far more details than can be here summarized. In Trotsky's The History of the Russian Revolution, Book 1, Trotsky made the following comparison with the United States. Quote, small enterprises, involving less than 100 workers, employed in the United States, in 1914, 35% of the total of industrial workers, but in Russia, only 17.8%. The two countries had an approximately identical relative quantity of enterprises involving 100 to 1,000 workers. But the giant enterprises, above 1,000 workers each, employed in the United States 17.8% of the workers, and in Russia 31.4%. For the most important industrial districts, the latter percentage is still higher. For the Petrograd district, 44.4%. For Moscow district, even 57.3%. End quote. Trotsky, The History of the Russian Revolution. End footnote. Trotsky's statistics, although obviously selective, are generally borne out by other sources. Footnote. See Tugendbaranovsky, something in Russian. Seton Watson, The Decline of Imperial Russia, 1855 to 1914. And also Seton Watson's The Russian Empire, 1801 to 1917. The description for Hugh Seton Watson's Decline of Imperial Russia, 1855 to 1914 says, this book, originally published in 1952, describes and explains the stage of the decline of the Russian Empire between the Crimean and First World Wars. The decline of Imperial Russia is divided up by period. The reign of Alexander II from 1855 to 1881, the period of reaction, 1881 to 1905, the, quote, revolution of 1905 and its aftermath, 1905 to 1914, and also into three sections, the structure of state and society, political movements, and foreign relations. and Hussein Watson's The Russian Empire, 1801 to 1917. The description says, from the reign of Alexander I to the abdication of Nicholas II, this wide-ranging survey of Russian history follows the development of institutions, classes, political movements, and individuals, and draws on a large body of documentary material and contemporary scholarship, making an important contribution to pre-revolutionary Russian studies. Back to the text and footnote. There is room in them for greater refinement of detail in Trotsky's statistics. But there can be no argument about the overall correctness of the phenomenon they portrayed, namely, of a backward society assimilating in an extremely short span of time the most advanced forms of industrial production, of which the outstanding was the large factory or enterprise built on the principle of the high concentration of workers. Moreover, as Trotsky pointed out elsewhere, this was accomplished by the introduction of the latest machinery and production methods, by the use of finance capital, by high exploitation of natural resources, by a policy of protective tariffs, by the extensive development of railways and communications, and by the creation of large urban centers. In short, by all those features which were both preconditions and the permanent characteristics of an industrial economy. Trotsky's emphasis on the advanced nature of the development of Russian industry was not intended to conceal either the limits of this development or the very different and still dominant features of Russian society. Trotsky did not mean it to be an argument so common and prevalent at the time amongst Russian Marxists, which would show that Russia was becoming a capitalist country like any other, and that it was now only a matter of time before this process was culminated. On the contrary, the emphasis on industrial capacities was placed by Trotsky in the context of the more general reality, and was meant in fact as an argument against seeing Russia in either white or black terms, as either capitalist or, quote, feudal, or becoming the one and ceasing to be the other. For the whole point of emphasis was that while the state, on the one hand, was prepared to introduce modern industry, and on a scale necessary for its purposes, on the other, it was determined not to allow parallel changes in society and politics. The state believed, in other words, that it could industrialize without disturbing either existing social relations or its traditional political authority and institutions. Hence, it bypassed or largely ignored Russia's existing economic foundations, though this was also governed by considerations of speed, since to have built on these foundations would have meant delaying the pace of industrialization. Hence, industry was, quote, grafted on, end quote, in the tradition of Russia's other periodic bursts of modernization, or adaptation to the outside world, a tradition going back to Peter the Great, and even beyond. The consequence was, not unlike analogous adaptations in the past, that an industrial sector was created without really affecting, much less transforming, the traditional economy of the country. The two were simply made to exist side by side, and the state thus continued to rest on the traditional pillars of the state's power and legitimacy, the peasantry and the landowning nobility. This, according to Trotsky, accounted for the stark contradictions of Russian society in the wake of industrialization. In a vivid passage in 1905, Trotsky describes the phenomenon thus, quote, in Europe, 5.4 million square kilometers, in Asia, 17.5 million square kilometers, and a population of 150 million. In this enormous area, all epochs of human development, from the primitive savagery of the northern forests, where men eat raw fish and worship trees, to the most modern social relations of the capitalist city, the most concentrated industry in Europe, based on the most backward agriculture in Europe, the most colossal governmental apparatus in the world, exploiting all the achievements of technical progress to arrest the historical progress of its own country, end quote, Trotsky. And that's from 1905, the collection of essays, 1905, by Trotsky. Such contradictions in Russia's social and economic reality made it impossible to classify the country under standard, quote, either-or, unquote, categories. Russia's industrial progress, Trotsky wrote in later years, was difficult to reconcile with the conventional, quote, banal notion of backwardness. Quote, however, Trotsky added, quote, it does not disprove ... backwardness, but dialectically completes backwardness, end quote. Trotsky. The History of the Russian Revolution, Book 1. By this, Trotsky meant that the concept of backwardness had to be grasped in terms of the very contradictions and incongruities which are to be found in the reality of which it was an abstraction. Had the state therefore succeeded in isolating the economic, that is, industry, from the social and political, and from the old economic foundations? Had the state managed to create an industrial island, thereby satisfying the state's external needs and ambitions without disturbing the greater empire over which the state presided? True, the coexistence of the primitive and the modern suggested that the gamble had indeed come off, and may even be perpetuated indefinitely. But this, in Trotsky's view, was to take the situation as the situation was and project the situation into the future without taking account of its internal mechanisms. Precisely because Russian backwardness did not conform to static categories, precisely because Russian backwardness was dynamic, the notion that Russian backwardness could persist in its initial form was questionable in the first place. Contradictions being incompatible, contradictions cannot be expected to be sustained forever. The contradiction between the modernity of industry and the primitiveness of agriculture was obvious, but industry itself was creating new contradictions of industry's own, so that other elements were penetrating the Russian social structure. The whole was in fact assuming a different character, though a character peculiar, again, to the specifically Russian path of historical development. The underside of Russian society, during the period roughly corresponding to that of industrialization, was, Trotsky would now argue, changing beyond recognition. New section, Section B, the Russian town. Before industrialization, Trotsky noted, Russian towns had no economic function. Footnote. Trotsky's analysis of the growth of Russian towns owed much to the ideas of Parvis, but both in fact drew on Miliukov. End footnote. Towns were, quote, administrative, military, tax-collecting centers, end quote. The town's inhabitants, who were, quote, employed in one form of state service or another, lived at the expense of the exchequer, end quote. The population was for the most part consisted of officials, some merchants and peasants, quote, seeking refuge within city walls, end quote. Trotsky. The towns were thus not centers of production, not even economic units. On the contrary, the, quote, Russian towns, like the towns under the Asiatic despotisms, played only the role of, quote, consumers. On the contrary, the, quote, Russian towns, like the towns under the Asiatic despotisms, played only the role of consumers, end quote. And this was in complete contrast with the growth of towns and cities in the West. Quote, the guild craft was the basis of the European medieval city culture, which radiated also into the village. Medieval science, scholasticism, religious reformation grew out of the craft guild soil, The craft guild culture of the West formed itself on a relatively high level of economic development, when all the fundamental processes of the manufacturing industries had been distinguished from agriculture, had been converted into independent crafts, had created their own organizations, their own focuses, the cities, and at first, a limited ... but nevertheless stable, market. At the basis of the medieval European city, there lay a comparatively high differentiation of industry, giving rise to regular interrelations between the city center and the city center's agricultural periphery. End quote. Trotsky. Footnote. Appendix 1 to Volume 1 of The History of the Russian Revolution. This appendix consists of excerpts from two articles written for Pravda, 1st and 2nd of July 1922, and later published as an appendix to the second and subsequent editions of 1905. End footnote. None of this had happened in Russia. Instead, here, in Russia, manufacturing industry and the crafts remained in the country attached to agriculture. Quote, our economic backwardness, found our economic backwardness's expression in the fact that craft, not yet separated from agriculture, preserved the form of home industry. Here we were nearer to India than to Europe, just as our medieval cities were nearer to the Asiatic than the European type, Our Reformation remained at the stage of the peasant sect, because it found no leadership from the cities. Primitiveness and backwardness here cry to the heavens, End quote. Trotsky. Footnote. See also page 29 of The History of the Russian Revolution, where Trotsky wrote, quote, the insignificance of the Russian cities, which more than anything else promoted the development of an Asiatic state, also made impossible a reformation, that is, a replacement of the feudal bureaucratic orthodoxy by some sort of modernized kind of Christianity adapted to the demands of a bourgeois society. The struggle against the state church did not go farther than the creation of peasant sects, the faction of the old believers being the most powerful among them. End quote. Trotsky. End footnote. When Europe industrialized on the foundations of the cities which had been created. From their midst came the skills, the organizational techniques, the entrepreneurial acumen, the divisions of labor which were later incorporated into modern industry. The switch from an agricultural to an industrial economy, having been mediated through the cities, was smooth, gradual, natural. A solid, non-agricultural, independent economic base had been forged. When industrialization came, it did not need to depend on agriculture. Moreover, Trotsky believed, in the West the emergence of new classes in itself attested to the smoothness of the changeover. The growth of independent town manufacturing concerns and industries created an independent class, the bourgeoisie, strong enough to tear itself away from agriculture, eventually powerful enough and broad enough to confront the absolutist state. When Russia industrialized, however, Russia industrialized without independent towns. Instead, industrialization itself created urban economic centers, another example of the peculiarities of backward development. Thus, just as an enormous industrial structure was created where almost none had existed before, so an enormous urban population came into being virtually overnight. Trotsky noted that in 1724, that is, at the end of the reign of Peter I, the town population numbered 328,000, or 3% of the total inhabitants of the country. In 1796, it had reached 1,300,000, or about 4% of the total. In 1812, it stood at 1,653,000, or 4.4%, and in 1851 at 3,482,000, or 7.8%. This relatively slow pace of growth was then followed by a spectacular leap. According to the census of 1897, the population of the towns was now 16,289,000, although this still accounted for only about 13% of the total population. Footnote. Trotsky acknowledged that these figures were taken from Miliukov. Trotsky repeated them in his 1905. End footnote. Trotsky cited other statistics to show the suddenness of urban growth. Between 1885 and 1897, the increase in the urban population was equivalent to 33.8%, or more than twice the increase in the population of Russia as a whole, 15.25%, and nearly 3 times the increase in the rural population, 12.7%. Some individual cities had even more rapid increases. Thus, Moscow, for instance, during the period of the 35 years before 1905, grew from 604,000 to 1,359,000, i.e., by 123%. The importance of these changes, however, was not reflected in numbers alone. The very nature of the town or city had become transformed. The modern Russian town had become a commercial and industrial center, and the social and economic character of its inhabitants had changed accordingly. Footnote: for further details of Trotsky's view of Russian urban development, see History of the Russian Revolution, Book 1, Chapter 1. End footnote. New section, Section C, the Industrial Bourgeoisie. That rhymed, didn't it? That sounded nice. 2 prerequisites, according to Trotsky, are necessary for the growth and development of a bourgeoisie. Firstly, that a part of the nobility or gentry break away from the traditional individual land economy and turn to commercial interests, initially agricultural, eventually manufacturing and industrial, and, secondly, that portion of the peasantry engaged in arts and crafts become attached to the towns, gradually independent of agriculture, eventually the nucleus of that which is properly called the pre-industrial urban bourgeoisie. Footnote. Never mind, no footnote. In the case of Russia, Trotsky wrote, both these prerequisites remained unfulfilled. The nobility, for the most part, remained tied to the land since, among other things, it is prevented by the state from striking out on its own. The land remained for its social and economic basis, the state its protector. Even after 1905, when it became politically active, it was primarily to defend its land interests, at a time when the state, under pressure from other sectors, seemed on the verge of abandoning its protector role. As for the artisans, who, according to the 1897 census, numbered 4 million, they remained tied to the village and the countryside, and eventually were engulfed, and thus nullified as an independent force, by the sudden coming of large industry which, quote, proletarianized, end quote, them. They, quote, had no time to develop, end quote. So, a Russian bourgeoisie had no roots from which to grow, and the liberal democratic ideas which later appeared amongst a segment of the intelligentsia were to be plagued by this fact forever, as Trotsky argued in another context. Whatever bourgeoisie there was at the end of the 19th century consisted for the most part of members of the professions, bureaucrats and only a small class of merchants, with the whole lacking any, quote, bourgeois ethos or class solidarity. Footnote. According to the 1897 census, to which Trotsky often referred, quote, merchants numbered 281,179, approximately 220,000 persons. Just over 500,000 with dependents, were listed as belonging to the professions, of whom over 166,000 were teachers, some 21,000 occupied in the arts and literary professions, another 21,000 in the medical professions, 4,000 engineers and technologists, nearly 9,000 barristers and attorneys. Persons employed in the central government numbered nearly 100,000. About 270,000 with dependents, and in local government, some 105,000, 300,000 with dependents. The categories were not always clearly defined, and there was probably some overlapping, but the figures provide an approximately accurate picture. See Seton Watson, The Russian Empire, 1801 to 1917. End footnote. If, however, a pre-industrial urban bourgeoisie, which Trotsky considered so essential to the subsequent growth of an independent bourgeoisie, had never come into being, a post-industrial business or, quote, capitalist class, end quote, did suddenly spring up. This, for Trotsky, was another example of the, quote, uneven, seemingly illogical development of social phenomena in Russia. Of these businessmen, although most were also merchants of one kind or another, some were also big entrepreneurs, real capitalists, created by the state to run the huge industries, making large profits and undoubtedly enjoying a certain degree of influence in court circles. To Trotsky, the existence of such capitalists showed that just as in industrial production, Russia had skipped over various stages to reach the most advanced methods, so in a parallel and related way, in fact in a way growing directly out of this, quote, shortcut, Russia had skipped over various social stages to create the most advanced capitalist class. But just as in the economy, there was no mediation between the lower agricultural foundations and the higher industrial foundations. So in the social structure, there was no mediation between, on the one hand, the lower classes, and on the other, the upper classes engaged in industrial production. And for this very reason, the capitalist class was itself fundamentally weak, for it lacked a wider social basis on which it could rely in a confrontation with the state. Moreover, it lacked the tradition of fighting for its interests. Quote, big capital obtained big capital's economic rule without a struggle, end quote. Trotsky. Big capital had been directly created at the beckoning of the state, not in opposition to the state, or out of a natural evolution of internal economic forces. And big capital had for the same reason no cause to confront the state. Big capital's profits were, after all, substantial. Big capital's alliance with the state amply rewarding. Finally, whatever the size of the profits, and however generous the favors of the state, the source of it all was foreign capital. Without foreign capital, the whole industrial edifice would collapse. So the capitalists, no less than the state, were dependent on foreign capital, and this foreign capital flowed through the state. This foreign capital flowed through the state. So the capitalists and the state were first of all dependent on foreign capital. And as for the European bourgeoisie, the purveyor of the capital, it was hardly interested in the collapse of the Russian autocracy. Quote, the aristocracy of the stock exchange, which dominates European countries and which, without making any special effort, turned the Tsarist government into the aristocracy of the stock exchange's vassal, did not want to join the bourgeois opposition in Russia, ... End quote. Quote, the European stock exchange was even directly interested in the maintenance of absolutism, for no other government could guarantee such usurious interest. End quote. Trotsky. Thus Russia's backwardness, according to Trotsky, was also incongruous when viewed in the context of the development of Russia's bourgeoisie. Here too there was the same, quote, uneven, asymmetrical development which characterized the rest of Russian society. They were, quote, big capitalists, but hardly any bourgeoisie in the wide social sense. Industrial economic interests, but no bourgeois class interests, were solidarity, upper middle class luxury, but no middle class ethos or culture. Consequently, between the top and bottom of Russian society, as between the top and bottom of the economy, there was still a vacuum. Quote, the social character of the Russian bourgeoisie and the Russian bourgeoisie's political physiognomy were determined by the condition of origin and the structure of Russian industry. The extreme concentration of this industry alone meant that between the capitalist leaders and the popular masses, there was no hierarchy of transitional layers, ... End quote. Trotsky. That's from History of the Russian Revolution, Book 1. Quote, between the masses and the autocracy there stood a capitalist bourgeoisie, very small in numbers, isolated from the, quote, people, half foreign, without historical traditions, and inspired only by the greed for gain, end quote. Trotsky. New section. Section C. Section D. The New Proletariat. The whole of Trotsky's survey of Russian society in the wake of industrialization was meant to lead up to and culminate with the proletariat, which Trotsky saw as the most conspicuous and most significant example of the dynamics of Russian backwardness. Trotsky stressed the fact that the Russian proletariat was created in a matter of decades only. In the West, this class had emerged more or less gradually, and in any case, following the development of a working town population. In Russia, together with industrialization, the workers were formed suddenly, and before, quote, producing, towns had come into existence, before such towns could provide a nascent working class reservoir for new industry. In fact, the growth of towns was parallel to that of the workers, for it was in effect the creation of new workers which created cities. A working class population came into being before a bourgeoisie, and the towns and cities became centers largely of the working class population and not the bourgeoisie. Footnote. But, as Trotsky noted in 1905, many industrial enterprises and thus workers were located outside towns. End footnote. If the circumstances of the birth of the Russian proletariat were thus unique, so was the source from which it was mobilized. In the West, the workers also came initially from peasant backgrounds, but via a protracted and transforming detour. They became first agricultural laborers, later wage earners in the craft industry attached to towns, only afterwards employees of large industrial factories. In Russia, there was hardly an intermediary process. Here, according to Trotsky, the workers, quote, were thrown into the factory cauldron snatched directly from the plow, end quote. Trotsky. Appendix 1, History of the Russian Revolution, Book 1. There being an insufficient labor force in the towns, industry reached into the vast agricultural reservoir, where destitution made wage labor attractive to the peasant. Quote, ... The reservoir from which the Russian working class formed, the Russian working class itself, was not the craft guild, but agriculture, not the city, but the country. Moreover, in Russia the proletariat did not arise gradually through the ages, carrying with the proletariat itself the burden of the past, as in England, but in leaps involving sharp changes of environment, ties, relations, and a sharp break with the past, end quote. Trotsky. History of the Russian Revolution, Book 1. For many, the, quote, break with the past was only partial. Many took work in the towns but continued to live in the village. Thus they commuted between an industrial milieu and the old rural milieu. For this reason, such workers were more conscious of the contrast between the past and the present, between an old and traditional way of life and a new, urban way of life. The lack of a transitional period, of an opportunity for psychological adjustment to new patterns of existence, was emotionally unsettling, but simultaneously made the Russian worker more sharply aware of his social roots. Quote, the Russian proletariat was forever repeating the short history of the Russian proletariat's origin, while in the metal industry, a layer of hereditary proletarians was crystallized out, having made a complete break with the country. In the Urals, the prevailing type was half proletarian, half peasant. A yearly inflow of fresh labor forces from the country in all the industrial districts kept renewing the bonds of the proletariat with the proletariat's fundamental social reservoir. End quote. Trotsky. How large was the proletariat? Basing himself on the statistics of the 1897 census, Trotsky gave the total figure of 9,372,000, which, together with dependents, Trotsky claimed to account for 27.6% of the entire population. Footnote. The figure appearing there is actually 9,272,000, but this is an obvious printing error since the total adds up to 9,372,000. End footnote. But this was an obvious exaggeration. The total figure included some 6 million not involved industry at all, but employed in agriculture, in fishing and hunting, or as artisans, servants, and house porters. Trotsky's criterion seems to have been wage labor, but this surely included many, like the above categories, who could be considered working class only in the loosest meaning of the term. The more reasonable approximate total figure is 3 million, which is the estimate of M.I. Tugan-Baranovsky, who had made a special study of the question. And this figure, in fact, approximates to the total, about 3.3 million, which Trotsky listed in accordance with the census as employed in mining and manufacturing industries, in transport, in construction, and in commercial enterprises. Moreover, it was this category which Trotsky himself considered as being the most relevant, the most socially and politically aware. The lower figure was, of course, small in relation to the rest of the population, but Trotsky emphasized its absolute significance. Quote, to judge the actual and potential importance of the proletariat by the proletariat's relative numbers would be to fall into the gross error of failing to perceive the social relations behind bare figures. End quote. Trotsky. Thus, firstly, Trotsky stressed that the figure of some 3 million, or about 10 million with dependents, was large in absolute terms. That is, it constituted a population having an independent force of numbers. It was not some tiny marginal group. Secondly, it was fairly homogeneous, subject to more or less similar economic conditions and sharing a common environment. Thirdly, it was highly concentrated, either in places of work or by regions. It was not so dispersed as the peasantry, whose large numbers lost much of their significance as a result. The proletariat formed, quote, the core of the population of every city of any economic or political importance, end quote. Footnote. According to the 1897 census, the population of towns included 13,386,392 persons who came under the category of Meshchane. I don't know. This category consisted of small shopkeepers, white-collar employees, artisans, and urban workers. It may be assumed that by far the greatest portion belonged to the last classification, i.e. workers and their dependents. See Seton Watson, The Russian Empire, 1801 to 1917. End footnote. Finally, it was strategically located economically. The most important forms of economic production were dependent upon it, the proletariat in Russia. As in the West, as were the railroads, without which the whole industrial framework could not function. The combination of numbers, high concentration, homogeneity of environment, proximity to more advanced forms of life had, in Trotsky's view, turned the workers into an independent class having its own cultural characteristics. Notwithstanding its still existing ties with the countryside, it was, Trotsky believed, a new force within the Russian social structure. Jesus Christ. Trotsky emphasized again and again the fact that the Russian proletariat was created before a Russian bourgeoisie, that moreover, it came into existence and became a social class before the fundamentally agricultural economy of Russia was transformed into an industrial, much less capitalist one, that finally its economic importance was far greater than that of the older, more established social classes. All these factors for him constituted additional elements in the peculiarity of Russian development in general, Russian backwardness in particular. This was best brought out, in Trotsky's view, by the fact that in Western Europe, at the time of Western Europe's, quote, bourgeois revolutions, no working class, quote, in the modern sense, end quote, had existed, while in Russia, a nation without a bourgeoisie, much less a bourgeois revolution, a substantial modern proletariat was already an obvious social factor. If, therefore, one returned to that vacuum which Trotsky claimed had been created in Russian society by the absence of an independent middle class, one would find, according to Trotsky, that this vacuum between the state and the masses was now being filled in a unique way by a new social force with political implications far beyond itself. These implications would constitute the basis for Trotsky's reformulation of the Marxist theory of revolution and of much else besides. Okay, so that is the end of this section, which again was titled The Impact of Industrialization. Thank you so much for listening.